In the heart of Ouagadougou, Issa Diallo faces a choice that could destroy a nation or save his son. $5 million, one loaded gun, thousands watching. He was a protector until something broke. But what do you do when loyalty costs more than your soul vie? The drums of celebration shook the earth. In Ouagadougou Square, tens of thousands gathered under a blistering sun, their voices merging into a single roar. Traoré, Traoré, Traoré flags waved like waves in a red and gold ocean. Children danced on their fathers' shoulders. Old women clutched faded portraits of martyrs and vendors, weaved through the chaos with sugar cane and fried cassava. Above it all, on the grand marble balcony of the National Assembly, stood President Ibrahim Traoré, young, charismatic, defiant. He raised his fist to the crowd and the air exploded like thunder. To the people, he was more than a leader. He was hope given a name. But standing just a step behind him, almost swallowed in the shadow of that symbol, was Issa, Traoré's personal bodyguard, his most trusted man, and the one with a gun pointed at the president's back. The camera, if there was one, wouldn't see it. No one would. Issa's posture was perfect military. His sunglasses hid the storm inside. His left hand rested on his hip. His right gripped the sleek black pistol holstered beneath his ceremonial cloak. Except the pistol wasn't holstered, it was drawn, pressed lightly against the small of Traoré's back beneath the folds of red cloth, its barrel cold and unforgiving. Just one squeeze, one breath's length, and it would all be over. Issa's jaw clenched. Sweat traced a slow path down his temple, not from the heat, but from something colder. A weight, a price, a countdown. $3 million. Blood money wrapped in velvet words. Just do your job, Issa, the man had whispered. Only aim a little lower this time. Kruger, the foreign diplomat with the shark smile and dead eyes. The man who came offering salvation, or damnation. Issa's finger inched closer to the trigger. The cheers of the crowd faded into a distant hum. In his earpiece, the radio crackled. Security green. Perimeter secured. Irrelevant. He could end the story right here before anyone saw it coming. But then Traoré turned, just slightly, just enough to glance over his shoulder, just enough to flash that smile, that infuriating, gentle human smile, the one that made Issa feel for a moment like more than a weapon. You've been with me since the beginning, Brother Traoré said, his voice barely audible beneath the roar of the square. Stay close. I trust you. Trust. The word hit like a bullet. It echoed louder than any explosion Issa had heard on the battlefield. Louder than his son's wheezing breaths in that crumbling hospital. Louder than his wife's silent stare when he returned home with lies folded into his pocket. His finger hesitated. Just a twitch, but it was enough. In that fraction of a second, a dozen memories broke through like shattered glass. His son, burning with fever, clutching his finger in the darkness. The doctor's words, without treatment, he won't last another harvest. Kruger placing the briefcase on the table like a coffin made of leather. His wife silent but seeing everything. And yet, here stood Traoré, the same man who once lifted Issa out of a gutter in Ouagadougou, who gave him a name, a purpose, a place beside him not as a tool but as a brother. Issa blinked, his vision blurred. What am I doing? He gripped the gun tighter, not to fire, but to keep his hand from shaking. Because what if he did it? What if in the next heartbeat he pulled the trigger? No one would see it coming. No one would be able to stop it. He would vanish into diplomatic exile with new names, new passports, and his son alive, breathing. But at what cost? And then suddenly a boy in the crowd shouted something loud enough to cut through the madness. Look, he smiled at his guard. The president smiled at him. A dozen others turned upward. They were watching Issa now, smiling, waving, not at Traoré, at him, Issa, as if he was a hero, as if they somehow knew. Issa's chest tightened, his gun heavy like sin trembled in his hand. The people believed, and he was about to betray them all. The roar of the crowd surged like an unstoppable wave, but Issa heard none of it. Not the drums, not the chants, not even the brass band erupting behind them. All of it faded beneath the weight of something older, deeper, far more terrifying than the possibility of pulling the trigger. He heard a cough, a soft, weak rattling sound echoing from a rusted hospital bed. a child's breath caught between life and death. He could see his son's face damp with sweat cheeks, sunken lips cracked from fever. Oxygen tubes curled around his small nose like a noose. "We've done everything we can," the doctor had said, voice low, avoiding his eyes. But without the medication, without funds. The memory stung sharper than the sun on his skin. He remembered the sour smell of disinfectant, the flickering light in the hospital corridor, the rows of mothers with hollow eyes holding limp children like dolls unraveling at the seams. His wife standing at the window, unmoving, staring out into a world that had turned its back on them. And he remembered the click of leather, clean, expensive cold. Kruger. The man walked into that hospital like he owned it, like he owned everyone inside it. His hair was perfectly parted, his suit wrinkle-free, and his briefcase, glossy black, deliberate, sat beside Isa like a second heart pulsing with something that felt too much like power. 3 million, Kruger had said, not even pretending to whisper. His accent wrapped the words in velvet arrogance. Enough to buy your son more than hope. Real medicine, real doctors, real freedom. You could disappear tomorrow. New names, new passports, clean slates. Isa hadn't responded. His hands were fists in his lap. His wife had just called from the hospital, weeping without sound. Their son was slipping minute by minute. The bills piled higher than the boy's body. Every door they knocked on closed. "You don't even have to kill him," Kruger had added, sliding the briefcase across the floor with the grace of a serpent. "Just do your job. Be close. Pull the trigger. We'll handle the rest." It should have felt like hell. It didn't. It felt like silence, like numbness, like standing on a cliff staring down and realizing the fall was more merciful than the waiting. Isa's hand had hovered over the case. Just inches, just air between the man he was and the traitor he was about to become. Back in the square, the crowd screamed Traore's name again, loud enough to shake windows. The flags shimmered in the heat, the marble beneath his boots vibrating from the celebration. But none of that touched Isa, because the weight of the gun had changed. It was no longer metal and grip. It was Kruger's voice, his son's breath, his wife's silence, Traore's smile. The gun wasn't aimed at the president anymore. It was aimed at everything Isa had once believed in. And suddenly the crowd cheering behind him felt like ghosts cheering at a funeral they didn't know had already begun. President Traore raised his hand again and the square erupted. The sky seemed to pulse with sound voices, chant songs that hadn't been heard since the revolution. Hope, raw and unfiltered, echoed through every alley, bounced off every rooftop. It was the sound of people who still believed, still trusted in something fragile but alive. And in the center of it all, standing beneath a banner of the national flag, Traore turned. He turned to Isa. Just a glance at first, then a full turn of his shoulders. His face, weathered by speeches and battles and promises made under impossible conditions, softened. His lips curled into a smile that reached all the way to his eyes that saw Isa not as a weapon, not as a bodyguard, but as a man, as a brother. "You've been with me since the beginning," Traore said, voice low beneath the roar of the crowd, almost intimate. "Since we had nothing, not even boots, just dreams. Stay close, Isa. I trust you." Isa didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat locked. That word again, trust, wrapped around his lungs like rope. Trust. The kind of word you couldn't give back once it was broken. The kind that left scars when it shattered. His finger was still on the trigger, still resting there, still waiting. One pull. Just one. It would be over in a breath. It would be fast, clean. A shot from behind at close range. No chance for panic. No moment for Traore to realize what was happening. No chance to say goodbye. Isa told himself again, this is for my son, for his life, for his future. Traore would understand. He'd forgive me. Maybe. But his hands wouldn't move. Or rather, they wouldn't obey. They trembled. His training, decades of discipline, precision, loyalty told him to act, execute, deliver. But everything else, his gut, his memory, his heart screamed to stop. Traore had turned away again, waving to the people. Completely exposed. Trusting Isa with his back, with his life, with the fate of a nation. And Isa, just inches away, was still holding the gun. He thought of the jungle patrols when they were just young recruits hiding from gunfire and starvation, whispering stories of a future where their country would belong to its people. He remembered Traoré sharing the last piece of bread in the field, helping him carry the wounded across miles of mud, laughing under the rain like they were invincible. He remembered loyalty not as an order, but as a bond. His finger moved but away from the trigger. Instead, he lowered the gun, just a few centimeters, enough to break the spell, enough to breathe. He slipped it back beneath the ceremonial sash, slick with sweat. The steel brushed his ribs like a reminder, not yet, maybe not ever. The betrayal didn't happen that day, but it still lived in him, coiled and waiting. Traoré raised both hands, now soaking in the crowd's love, and Issa took a step back. Another, one more. No one noticed. They were too busy singing, too busy celebrating a future that still felt possible. Issa slipped from the platform like a shadow retreating at dusk. His face stone, his heart breaking silently. The gun was still loaded. The briefcase still sat under his son's hospital bed. The countdown hadn't stopped. He hadn't pulled the trigger, but he had already aimed it. The warehouse smelled like rust and rot, an old military depot abandoned long before the last coup. Cracks webbed across the concrete floor like veins in dry earth, and the high windows filtered in weak shafts of orange light, catching the dust that never settled. Somewhere above, a pigeon flapped restlessly in the rafters. Below it was silent, the kind of silence that waits before something terrible. Issa stood in the middle of the space boots, echoing faintly his posture, stiff as if even his bones resisted being there. He hadn't come in uniform. No rifle, no earpiece, no insignia. Just a plain brown shirt clinging to his back with sweat, and a thin layer of tension stretched across his skin like a second layer. At the far end of the room, next to a rusted table, Kruger waited. The foreign agent was the only thing in the warehouse untouched by the decay. His pale suit was tailored to the millimeter shoes polished to the point of obscenity. Hair-combed expression, relaxed posture, regal. A man too clean for a place this filthy. That in itself was threatening. Between them sat a black leather briefcase resting atop the table like a sleeping predator. It gleamed unnaturally under the flickering warehouse lights. Kruger didn't speak at first. He didn't have to. Instead, he leaned forward and gently placed a hand on the handle of the briefcase, stroking it once like it was something alive. His eyes, sharp and pale, never left Issa. "You know," he began, voice smooth and dry like dust in the throat. "What I hate most about Africans?" Issa said nothing. His fist tightened, his jaw clenched. Kruger smiled thinly. "You still believe in loyalty, in honor, in brotherhood. It's quaint, charming even, but foolish and dangerous, especially when you're a father." Issa's expression didn't change, but his breath grew shorter. He thought of his son still in that stifling hospital room with the broken ceiling fan and the mosquito net that couldn't keep death out. He thought of his wife, whose eyes had stopped hoping long before her voice had. Kruger snapped his fingers. A second man face hidden beneath sunglasses emerged from the shadows and slid a photo onto the table. Issa didn't want to look, but he did. His son lay curled under a threadbare sheet, eyes sunk in sweat pooling along his collarbones. A plastic oxygen tube looped under his nose. In the corner of the photo, his wife sat slumped in a cracked plastic chair, her hand barely touching the edge of the bed. Kruger's voice lowered. "He has days left, maybe less. And your president, your great hero, where is he? Still giving speeches, still promising miracles he can't deliver." The words slid into Issa like a knife. And worse, they struck bone. Because they weren't wrong. The rejection letters from embassies, the denial of funding, the closed doors the next week, brother. Replies from ministries all stacked like bricks around Issa's chest. Traoré meant well, yes, but well-meaning didn't buy medicine, didn't save dying children. Kruger opened the briefcase with a soft hiss. The inside gleamed bundles of crisp $100 bills, packed tight, flawless, untouchable. It looked too perfect, like it belonged in a movie. But there was nothing cinematic about the way Issa's breath caught. Kruger's voice was soft now, almost fatherly. 3 million, Issa, for a clean shot, for your son's future, for freedom from this burden you carry. Issa stared at the money. It didn't look like salvation. It looked like a trap made of paper, a bribe shaped like a coffin. Still, his hands moved. His fingers brushed the edge of the briefcase. Cold, smooth, final. He didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't need to. Kruger knew. He smiled slow and sure. I knew you were smarter than the rest, he said, standing. Delivery during the national address. Close range. No mistakes. Issa picked up the case. It felt heavier than a rifle. He turned without a word and walked out into the fading light, the handle digging into his palm like a brand. He didn't feel like a man who had saved his son. He felt like a man who had signed away his soul. The hallway leading to the children's ward was dim and damp. The walls of faded yellow, stained with humidity and time. The overhead lights flickered with each power surge, casting brief shadows that danced along the floor. The scent of disinfectant lingered heavily in the air, unable to cover the deeper bitter smell of sickness and despair. Issa walked with the briefcase held tightly at his side, wrapped in an old gray towel to dull the shine. He passed nurses who recognized him and nodded respectfully, but their eyes lingered longer than usual. A soldier in civilian clothes was always suspicious. A man with nothing but silence in his stride, even more so. He pushed open the metal door to his son's room without knocking. Inside, the small space was silent except for the hum of the oxygen machine. His son lay curled beneath a thin blanket, his chest rising in shallow, uneven rhythm. His skin had turned pale, almost translucent, the fever stealing color from his cheeks. The plastic tube beneath his nose bobbed slightly with each breath. His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. He was too weak for that now. On the far side of the room, Aminata stood with her back to the door. She was sorting through a tattered folder of medical charts, her movements methodical, almost robotic. Her shoulders were hunched in that familiar way, part exhaustion, part fear, part silent fury. She didn't turn when she heard him come in. Issa knelt beside the bed and carefully slid the towel-wrapped briefcase under the rusted metal frame. It barely fit. He pushed until it disappeared beneath the shadow of the mattress, the dull scrape of leather on steel echoing too loudly in the tight room. When he looked up, Aminata was staring at him now. She didn't say a word. Her eyes dropped to the floor, then back to his. There was no accusation in them, only knowing. A tired kind of knowing, the look of a woman who had seen men come and go, with secrets stitched under their skin. A woman who had seen souls eroded not by war, but by compromise. You found money, she said quietly. Issa hesitated, then nodded once. She didn't ask where. She didn't need to. She returned her gaze to the chart, flipping another page with careful fingers. The doctor says there's a trial treatment. Overseas medication. He might be eligible if we act fast. They're waiting on payment. Issa swallowed. It's there. All of it. Good, she said. Her voice didn't soften. He turned back to the bed and gently touched his son's forehead. Still hot. Burning. The skin dry and fragile. Issa tried to imagine the boy running again, laughing, asking endless questions like he used to, about clouds, about trucks, about the world beyond the hospital window. But now his chest only rose and fell like a clock running out. I'm doing what I can, Issa whispered. Aminata didn't respond. Her silence was louder than any scream. He remained there, kneeling beside the boy, his large hand resting on the small body that trembled beneath the fever. The oxygen machine hissed beside them, mechanical and uncaring. The briefcase, hidden just inches away, seemed to throb with a presence of its own. That money was supposed to save his child. Instead, it pulsed like a poison in the room. Issa felt it in his bones like lead. Every breath he took felt stolen. Every heartbeat borrowed. He reached out to smooth the blanket over his son's chest, then pulled it down slightly, covering the edge of the briefcase that peeked from under the bed like something obscene. Aminata finally spoke again. No matter what you did, you better pray it was worth it. Issa didn't answer. Couldn't. He stayed beside the bed until the boy's breathing steadied into sleep, though it was far from peaceful. He had brought money into the room. But peace was nowhere to be found. The palace gates swung open at sunrise as they always did, and Issa passed through them like a shadow returning to its place. He wore his uniform like armor, creased, perfectly polished boots reflecting the morning light, every button fastened with ritual precision. On the surface, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. The corridor smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee. Secretaries moved between wings with folders clutched to their chests. Junior guards saluted as Isa passed, unaware they were lifting their hands to a man carrying treason in his bloodstream. He nodded back, his expression unreadable. His training did the rest. No one suspected the storm boiling just beneath his skin. He stood post by the courtyard as instructed. The day unfolded in small familiar rituals, morning briefings, radio, check-ins, arrival of ministers, the usual political murmurs behind half-closed doors. But today the routine felt sharpened. Time moved slower. Every clock ticked louder. Every laugh echoed too long. By mid-morning, Traoré emerged from his office. No fanfare, no cameras. Just him, sleeves rolled, shirt slightly unbuttoned, greeting the kitchen staff by name, shaking hands with a new janitor like he was greeting an old friend. He spotted a group of children, staff members' kids, playing with a soccer ball in the courtyard, their shoes dusty, their laughter wild. Without hesitation, Traoré jogged toward them, picked up the ball with both hands, and launched it back into the game with an exaggerated spin that sent the kids cheering. They swarmed him like he wasn't the president, like he was theirs. Isa watched from a distance, unmoving. Each moment Traoré laughed felt like a blade pressing deeper into his ribs. Each time the president looked down to tie a boy's untied shoelace or knelt to listen to a child's question, it became harder for Isa to hold the weight in his chest. This is the man I'm supposed to kill. Not a tyrant, not a distant bureaucrat in glass towers, but someone who still played barefoot with the next generation. Someone who still believed in the dusty promises of the revolution they once bled for. Traoré caught Isa's eye across the courtyard and smiled, lifting a hand in greeting. It wasn't a political wave. It wasn't for show. It was the kind of wave a brother gave to another, silent, understood. Isa returned the gesture, barely lifting his fingers. His jaw tightened. Because Traoré's trust was constant, and every second Isa stood there pretending to protect him, he was lying. He mapped escape routes with his eyes, marked the places where surveillance cameras blinked out for 3.2 seconds. Memorized the path Traoré took to the balcony for his national address. Calculated angles, calculated silence, but each calculation dragged against something deeper, something older. Loyalty. Not the kind printed in military manuals, but the kind forged in mud and fear and hunger. The kind born under bullet fire and shared rations. The kind that once meant something. Traoré returned to the building, eventually patting a boy's head before disappearing behind the marble columns. The courtyard emptied slowly. Isa stood alone. The briefcase was gone, hidden away. The order was given. The deadline set. But inside him, the clock was louder than ever. And with every beat, it asked the same question. How do you kill a man who still believes in you? The pickup truck rattled along the dirt road, its suspension groaning under the weight of time and distance. Dust plumed behind it, a long orange trail dissolving into the heat-rippled horizon. The radio was dead, the air inside hot and dry, but Isa didn't mind. Silence was safer now. He needed it. The farther he drove from the capital, the more the landscape changed. Paved roads gave way to ruts and potholes. Billboards faded into termite-bitten signposts. Power lines disappeared altogether. It was like moving backward through time, watching progress unravel into memory. By the time he reached his childhood village, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over everything. The village hadn't changed. That was the most devastating part. The cracked well still stood at the center of the square, dry as the year he left. The same crooked church with its leaning bell tower cast a broken silhouette across the dusty plain. That same rusted swing hung from the tree where he used to wait for his father to return from the fields. Except now the village felt smaller, or maybe he had just grown. Isa stepped out of the truck and stretched his boots, sinking into the soft dirt. A few heads turned from porches and open doorways. Faces he recognized but aged. Some too old, some too tired. No one called his name. They only stared, then turned back to their quiet, sun-worn routines. He walked slowly, each step pressing deeper into a past he had tried for years to outrun. Past the abandoned medical hut where his mother once volunteered. Past the collapsed storage shed where he first kissed Aminata, awkward and breathless behind crates of millet. Past the square where his childhood self had stood with wide eyes reciting speeches of revolution he barely understood, but deeply believed in. And finally he arrived at the old schoolhouse. Its roof sagged inward, vines crawling through shattered windows. The walls, once painted blue and white, were now a patchwork of grime and graffiti. Half the front steps had crumbled. Issa stepped over them and pushed the door open with his shoulder. Inside, the air was thick with dust and rot. Desks lay overturned, their legs rusted and broken. Chalk fragments littered the floor like crushed bones. The blackboard at the front wall still stood tilted, cracked, but intact. And across its faded surface, written in chalk so faint it was almost lost to time, were 4 words. "The future is ours." Issa froze. He remembered writing those words. He had been 14. It was after a guest teacher visited from the capital talking about universities, about science and literature and dreams bigger than farmland and survival. Issa had stayed behind after class, waiting until everyone else left. Then he picked up a piece of chalk and scrawled that sentence across the board like a promise. He had wanted to be a teacher once. Not a soldier, not a killer, not a man with a gun and a price tag on his soul. A teacher. Someone who could make kids believe the world could be better than the one they were born into. He stepped forward and reached out his fingers, brushing over the chalk letters. They crumbled under his touch. The message turned to dust, like everything else. He sat slowly on the teacher's desk, the wood groaning under his weight. For a moment, he just stared at the blackboard. This is where it began, he thought, and this is where it broke. No cameras, no flags, no speeches. Just 4 forgotten words and a boy's dream buried beneath time. He looked out the window at the children playing barefoot in the dirt. No school books, no pencils, no future. He thought of the briefcase, of the money, of Traore's smile, of his son's labored breath. The dreams of boys didn't survive in places like this, and he was no longer a boy. The moon hung low over the hills outside the village, its pale light casting a silver sheen over the dry earth. Crickets sang in broken rhythm, and somewhere far off, a goat cried into the night. The road to the memorial was narrow, carved more by foot traffic than planning, winding through thorny brush and cracked stone. Issa walked alone, the briefcase gripped tightly in his left hand, the straps digging into his calloused fingers. It felt heavier now, not from the weight of the money, but from what it represented. A tether, a confession, a curse he couldn't shake. At the edge of a rise flanked by weeds and chipped concrete stood the grave of Thomas Sankara. A simple stone faded from years of sun and silence. The name, once etched boldly, was now shallow but still legible. No grand statue, no eternal flame, just earth, time, and memory. Issa stood over it for a long while, saying nothing. His heart thudded painfully against his chest. The breeze tugged at the hem of his shirt as if even the wind was impatient for him to speak. But the words wouldn't come. He stared at the grave like it could answer him, like it might offer forgiveness he hadn't earned. A voice crackled behind him, low, rough, like dry leaves underfoot. "You soldiers always come here when your hands start shaking." Issa turned sharply. An old man, barefoot and thin as bone, leaned against a crumbling stone nearby. His skin was lined like tree bark, and a battered pipe rested in the corner of his mouth, unlit. His eyes, though clouded with age, burned with clarity. "It ain't the dead who can't sleep," the old man continued. "It's the living." Issa didn't respond. He turned back to the grave. The man stepped closer, his voice growing quieter. "You carry something," he said, nodding to the briefcase. "Something you shouldn't. Something bought." Issa's jaw tensed. "It's for my son," he muttered. "He's dying." The old man didn't blink. "And you think killing your brother will bring him life?" Issa looked away. "I made a choice," he said. "There was no other way. There's always another way," the old man snapped. "But it's rarely the easy one." A long silence stretched between them, heavy as a noose. Issa stepped forward and dropped to his knees before the grave. He opened the briefcase. Stacks of $100 bills stared back at him, clean, untouched, indifferent. His hand shook as he grabbed a bundle and slammed it onto the stone. Again, and again, and again. The paper split. Plastic wrap burst. Currency scattered in the dirt like dead leaves. He grabbed more, ripping, smashing, grinding it into the gravel with his fists. Sweat poured down his face. His breath turned ragged. Rage erupted through him, not at Kruger, not even at Traore, but at himself. At the man who had said yes. When the last bill had been torn, Issa fell back, gasping, his chest heaving like he'd sprinted for miles. The wind picked up, carrying shredded green paper across the grave. He whispered, not to the old man, not to the wind, but to the stone I can't save him. The old man laid a bony hand on Issa's shoulder. Then fight for what's left, he said softly. Fight like Sankara did, knowing you might lose. That's what makes you a man. Issa didn't move, but the silence that followed no longer felt like guilt. It felt like the beginning of something else, something earned and deeply painful. The night was still when Issa returned to the house where he'd been born. It stood on the far edge of the village, half swallowed by thorny bush and thyme. The roof had sagged under years of heat and neglect, but the front door still opened with a groan that sounded like it remembered him. Inside, dust clung to the walls like memories, thick and unmoving. Issa crossed the one-room space and dropped to his knees in the corner. The floorboards creaked as he pried up a loose panel, one he'd hidden as a teenager, back when secrets were simpler and survival was a matter of hiding stolen mangoes, not morality. Beneath the floor, wrapped in oiled canvas and layers of cloth, lay the thing he'd buried long ago, his rifle. He lifted it with both hands gently, like lifting the bones of a fallen comrade. The weapon was old and outdated Kalashnikov from the early days of the revolution, but it had never failed him. The stock was scarred with nicks and grooves, and the barrel bore the faint traces of heat damage from nights spent firing into jungle darkness. He unwrapped it completely and sat cross-legged on the dirt floor, laying the weapon across his knees. He didn't move for a long time. The rifle was more than metal and wood. It was a piece of his former self, the man who once fought not for money, but for dignity. The boy who had believed he could change something. The soldier who swore an oath not to a government, but to his people. Back then, he hadn't known what corruption smelled like. He hadn't held briefcases of blood money. He hadn't aimed a pistol at the back of a friend's neck. Issa reached into a nearby crate and pulled out a small rusted tin. Inside, gun oil, a rag, a brush, and the careful ritual of remembering. He disassembled the rifle piece by piece, hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who had done it blindfolded once. The parts clicked apart with soft resistance, as if waking from long sleep. He cleaned each one slowly, deliberately. Not for battle, not for vengeance, but for justice. For something bigger than his own pain. Each motion scrubbed away a little more of the guilt that clung to him. The oil softened the rust, but the ritual softened the man. His hands were steady now, guided not by desperation, but decision. When the weapon was reassembled, he sat in silence, staring at it. It gleamed faintly under the weak lantern light, still deadly, still precise, but now reclaimed. No longer a tool of betrayal, a promise. He placed the rifle gently beside him, then reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph, one of his son taken before the sickness, before the weight of the world bent their backs. The boy's smile in the photo was wide, fearless, untainted. Issa laid the picture next to the rifle. One was to protect the child. The other was to protect the world that child would grow up in. He leaned back against the wall, the earth cool at his back, the weapon warm against his thigh. His breath slowed, his thoughts cleared. No more waiting, no more running. The decision had been made. Tomorrow he would return to the capital, but not as a bodyguard, not as a traitor, as the man he used to be, the one who carried a rifle not for power, but for the people. Issa closed his eyes, and for the first time in many weeks, he slept without dreaming of the trigger. The ballroom was suffocating. Cigarette smoke curled beneath a chandelier, dripping in crystal. Waiters in stiff collars moved between clusters of polished diplomats and local officials, their silver trays reflecting gold-plated laughter. Strings of violins filled the air with hollow elegance, and in every corner men in tailored suits spoke in tones too soft to be innocent. Issa stood near the champagne fountain, back straight, face blank, hands clasped behind him in the posture of a trained protector. To everyone around him, he was just another government guard, another body in a suit, but every cell in his body was screaming. Kruger emerged from the crowd like a shadow slipping off a wall, effortless, unbothered. Two men flanked him, expensive smiles plastered beneath dead eyes. He approached Issa casually, lifting a flute of champagne from a passing tray and pressing it into Issa's palm as if they were old friends meeting under more pleasant circumstances. "You're late," Kruger said, lips barely moving, eyes never looking directly at him. Issa didn't respond. He took the glass but didn't drink. His hand stayed behind his back. Kruger's grin thinned. Deadlines make men nervous, Issa. And when men like me get nervous, families start disappearing. The threat was dressed in velvet, but the blade beneath it was cold and sharp. Issa's jaw tightened. Kruger took a deliberate sip from his own glass and leaned closer, breath hot with wine and menace. Market Square. Tomorrow morning. National address. You know the route. The blind spots. The moment his back will be turned. Issa's fingers closed slightly around the glass stem. The shot must be clean. Public. Irrefutable, Kruger continued. No accidental delay. No last-minute changes of heart. You don't deliver, I don't deliver. And by deliver, I mean your son's body wrapped in a Western flag and buried in a box that says Made in America. Issa nearly broke the stem. He could feel heat rising through his chest, fury bubbling just beneath the surface, but he forced himself to remain still. He had heard threats before, as a soldier, as a bodyguard, as a father. But something about Kruger's ease, the way he treated life like a poker chip, struck a chord so deep, so raw, Issa almost forgot the plan. Almost. Kruger tapped his glass gently against Issa's. "Tick-tock, soldier," he said with a smirk. "Don't forget which side of the gun you're on." He turned and disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by velvet and violins. Issa stood frozen for several heartbeats, staring at nothing. The music swelled around him, laughter dancing in the air like dust motes in sunlight, but none of it touched him. The world had narrowed to two things: the boy in the hospital and the snake in the suit. He set the champagne down untouched. The time for hesitation was over. That night, alone in the back stairwell of the palace, Issa pulled out a small notebook and began scribbling. Routes, timings, blind spots, guard rotations. Not for the hit, for the trap. He would feed Kruger just enough, just what he wanted to hear. He would let the lie pass through whispers, back channels, the palace's fractured security. Let Kruger believe the betrayal was real. Let him believe Issa was still his dog. He would play his role perfectly right up to the moment the predator walked into his own snare. Because this time, Issa wasn't surviving for himself. He was fighting, and the clock. The clock wasn't ticking toward betrayal anymore. It was counting down to justice. At 3:47 a.m., beneath the flicker of a dying hallway light in the Ministry of Civic Planning, Issa slid a folded note under the door of an unmarked office. He didn't knock, didn't wait. He turned and walked away. His footsteps measured his breathing calm. The building was silent except for the hum of old power cables. No one saw him. That was the point. By sunrise, the message had spread like spilled oil in firelight. President Traoré will appear at Market Square. Unannounced. 10:00 a.m. No press, no ceremony. Just a surprise walkthrough meant to connect with the people. Of course it was a lie, but it was exactly the kind of lie someone like Kruger would believe. Issa knew him now. Understood the predator's hunger. Kruger didn't want chaos, he wanted symbolic death. Traoré shot in the heart of the city among mothers and merchants at the place where the revolution began. A warning in daylight, in blood. The bait was perfect, and they bit. Within hours, strange trucks began arriving at the capital's outer markets. Plates from neighboring countries, tarps pulled low over crates, men with clean boots pretending to be poor, their eyes too sharp to belong to vendors. Issa watched from a rooftop as one group parked near a spice stall, unloading barrels labeled as cassava oil. The way they moved, quick rehearsed checking angles told him everything. Mercenaries. Kruger's hands wearing peasant gloves. By mid-morning, there were at least 24 operatives spread across the square, posing as butchers, cart pushers, newspaper boys. Beneath the disguise were rifles in crates, radios tucked into belts, silence behind their eyes. The market square was ready to become a grave, unless the trap held. Issa returned to the palace steps, brisk heart locked in rhythm. At the North Barracks, he entered through a side gate and found Captain Mady, head of Traoré's inner guard, alone in the weapons cage. The man didn't look up as Issa approached. "You sure this is clean?" Mady asked, voice low. "As clean as it gets," Issa replied. "They're here, armed, disguised. They're expecting a target." And Traoré Issa hesitated. "He's not going anywhere near that square." "But they don't know that." Captain Matey nodded, then unlocked a nearby chest, pulling out a battered folder marked with red tape. Inside were operation schematics, undercover placements, and deployment maps. This wasn't a last-minute scramble. This was a silent mobilization. Matey and his men had been waiting for someone to light the match. By noon, plainclothes officers had taken positions inside market stalls, rooftops, and alleyways. Vendors loyal to the regime were quietly evacuated, replaced by trained soldiers dressed in sandals and aprons. The local radio station, state-controlled but discreet, was ordered to loop music all morning. No news, no mention of Traoré. They wanted Kruger's eyes to stay blind. Issa walked through the square once more at 9:00 a.m., just as the market began to hum with half-hearted commerce. A woman sold cloth in the shade, nodding to him once as he passed. A boy sharpened knives at a stall with his uncle, both of them armed beneath their tunics. On a balcony across the square, a sniper with a sack of oranges beside him pretended to nap. Everyone was in place. Still, something inside Issa twisted, because for all their precision, this wasn't a guarantee. Kruger had power, money, influence that stretched into the palace itself. All it would take was one misstep, one leak, and the ambush would turn into a massacre. He thought of his sons sleeping now in a clinic outside the city, miles from the square, miles from this war. He thought of the briefcase burning to ash on Sankara's grave, and he reminded himself this isn't survival anymore. It's a reckoning. At 9:41 a.m., Issa checked his watch one last time, then pressed the mic clip beneath his collar. All teams green light. Maintain silence. Eyes open. Across the square, a dozen radios clicked softly in reply. The trap was set. Now they waited for the serpent to strike. Dawn broke like a whisper over the market square. First came the smoke from cooking fires curling into the pink sky. Then the chatter of women arranging vegetables, the clang of tin pots, and the high-pitched laughter of barefoot children chasing pigeons between stalls. Life returned one sound at a time, as if the city had no idea it was teetering on the edge of violence. Issa moved like a ghost. He passed behind the fabric stalls and spice carts, slipping through narrow alleyways until he reached the back of the old bakery, the one with its bricks scorched from the uprising years ago. No one used the upper floor anymore, not since the oven shut down. But Issa had mapped it weeks ago, quietly, carefully. It offered the perfect line of sight across the square, just above the fruit stalls, just shy of the clock tower's shadow. He climbed the back stairwell, rifle strapped across his back beneath a long shawl. His boots barely made a sound on the cracked concrete steps. Each one brought him closer to the moment he could no longer undo. When he reached the rooftop, he dropped to a crouch beside the broken chimney. The morning wind was cool here, sharper. The rifle slid from his back into his hands with the weight of memory. He checked the sights, loaded, the magazine, adjusted the scope. Every motion was slow, controlled, ritual. This wasn't panic. It wasn't revenge. It was a decision. Below, the market bloomed like it did in better times. A mother lifted her daughter to smell guavas. A boy bargained with an old vendor over the price of a wooden toy. A soldier disguised as a butcher wiped sweat from his brow while scanning the rooftops behind his mirrored sunglasses. Everything was ready. Issa took a slow breath and braced the rifle against the lip of the rooftop. He wasn't aiming at Traoré. That much was clear now. He was aiming for the snakes hidden beneath the surface, the ones who thought they could orchestrate murder and still sleep at night. Kruger's men were out there playing farmer vendor baker, all wearing masks, but Issa had removed his. He lined up his first target, the one posing as a tired man with a broom and a limp too fit, too tense, too close to the center of the square. The angle was clean. Behind him, bells from the chapel began to toll the hour. 10 o'clock. The time the president was supposed to arrive. The time the gunmen were waiting for. But Traoré was nowhere near this place. Only justice was coming today. Issa's finger hovered over the trigger. His breathing slowed. His pulse steadied, syncing with the rhythm he'd learned as a boy in the jungle. He whispered into the wind voice, too soft for anyone but the ghost to hear. No more clocks. Only justice now. And he fired the first shot. The first shot split the morning like thunder. Issa didn't flinch. His bullet struck clean the man, with the limp crumpled beside his broom, blood blooming through his fake vendor's tunic before he could even reach for the rifle strapped to his back. For a fraction of a second, the market square froze. Then it shattered. Gunfire exploded from three corners at once. Crates of oranges burst apart. A table of spices flipped as two more disguised mercenaries ducked and opened fire. The air turned electric with the sharp cracks of suppressed rifles and the sudden terrible screams of civilians. Mothers grabbed children and bolted. A boy stumbled and fell scattering tomatoes across the dirt as he scrambled behind a cart. Merchants shouted in panic, overturning stalls as they ran. Glass shattered somewhere near the bakery's edge. Issa pivoted, already sighting the next gunman, a bearded figure near the well aiming blindly into the crowd. Issa squeezed the trigger. One shot, center mass, down. Below the trap finally sprung. Captain Matey's men, dressed as common vendors and musicians, threw off their disguises. Rifles appeared from beneath burlap sacks. Pistols were drawn from aprons and baskets. A woman who had been selling scarves tossed aside her goods and shouted a command in Wolof flank. The east wall guards moved with discipline and fury, pouring out from the alleys and rooftops. They didn't fire wildly. They had trained for this, waited for this. The enemy, thinking they had the element of surprise, found themselves surrounded, outnumbered. Still, they fought like men cornered by truth. One mercenary, snarling through bloody teeth, fired into a group of civilians, hitting an old man in the leg. Another hurled a smoke grenade toward the fish stall, trying to mask their retreat. But smoke wouldn't save them. Issa adjusted his sight again. Through the haze, he spotted a sniper crouched behind crates, taking aim at one of the palace guards. Crack. The sniper dropped without a sound. But the chaos was far from over. Gunfire echoed across the rooftops. Civilians screamed and ducked beneath tables. A young girl with braids ran for cover, then froze, paralyzed in the center of the square. Issa's heart stopped. He watched helpless from above. Then someone tackled her. Not a soldier, but a butcher. One of the real vendors. A man with no uniform, no gun, just a cleaver in his belt and fire in his eyes. He shoved the girl behind a barrel, then picked up a fallen pistol from the ground and turned it toward the mercenaries. And suddenly something shifted. The people were fighting back. Not just guards, not just soldiers, but the market itself. The square, so often a place of bargaining and hunger, rose up in fury. A woman threw a rock at a fleeing attacker. A fruit vendor used a broomstick to knock a gun from another's hands. A pair of teenage boys overturned a food cart to form a barricade for wounded civilians. Issa couldn't stop. He kept firing, covering their movements, protecting the ones who had never held a weapon in their lives. The mercenaries panicked. Their lines broke. Their plan was failing, and they knew it. One tried to escape through a side alley. Crack. Issa dropped him with a shot to the spine. Another hurled his weapon and raised his hands, crying out in broken French. He was tackled by two guards and dragged into the courtyard. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Time was tangled now. Then silence. No more bullets. Just panting, crying, the hiss of smoke dissipating. Issa lowered his rifle. Below, the square was scorched and battered, but still standing. People emerged slowly from hiding places, blinking through dust and gunpowder faces, smeared with sweat and fear. And above them, on the roof of a forgotten bakery, Issa watched the crowd gather around their wounded and dead, around the girl who was safe, around the guards who had protected them, not with orders, but with conviction. He exhaled slowly. This wasn't survival. It wasn't revenge. This was courage, and it was far from over. It was supposed to be a massacre. But by mid-morning, the market square was an uprising. Vendors, those who had once sold pineapples and sandals, were now wielding broomsticks, kitchen knives, and rusted machetes. Mothers who had hidden their children behind overturned tables now stood over them like warriors, flinging stones with surgical fury. Teenagers hurled bottles, kicked over enemy equipment, and used empty crates as shields. There was no coordination, no command, only instinct, only fire. Across the chaos, smoke curled upward, black and defiant, as flags once used for shade were burned to signal resistance. The scent of gunpowder clung to everything. Cries of pain mixed with war chants that hadn't been sung since the early revolution. But then something happened. From the far end of the square, just as the last gunshots were fading into silence, a motorcade came to a halt, abrupt, unannounced. Doors flew open. For a moment, soldiers and survivors alike turned their weapons toward it, uncertain. And then he stepped out. President Makan Traoré, No armor, no bulletproof glass, just him. Dressed in a plain white shirt, dust on his sleeves, boots caked in road mud, his presence carved through the chaos like lightning through clouds. Guards scrambled to shield him, but he waved them off. He walked straight into the square, past the bodies, past the barricades of broken fruit carts and shattered market stalls, and into the heart of his people. Gasps rose from the crowd. Eyes widened. Someone shouted, "Get him out of here!" But Traoré didn't flinch. He knelt beside a bleeding man and pressed a hand to the wound. He stood again and lifted a child in his arms, a girl who had been separated from her mother. Her sobs died as he whispered something into her ear, and then he spoke. Not from a podium, not into a microphone, but from the ground to the people as one of them. "No foreign bullet will decide our future," he said, voice hoarse but clear. "They came to divide us, to shame us, to prove that the people of Ouagadougou would scatter at the sound of guns. But look around." He swept his arm toward the bruised and bleeding crowd, toward the women with fists clenched, the elders who still stood, the children peeking out from behind crates with fire in their eyes. "We are still here." A silence followed, one thick with disbelief, with awe. Then someone shouted, "Ouagadougou lives," and another, "For Traoré." Then a chant rose, slow at first, then roaring. "Ouagadougou, Ouagadougou, Ouagadougou," from rooftops, from alleyways, from every broken stall they chanted like thunder. Issa, still perched on the rooftop above, gripped his rifle tight, but not to fire, not to aim. He stared down at the man he was meant to kill, and saw not a target, not a politician. He saw the soul of a nation. Traoré didn't just stand among the people. He became them, not a symbol, not a savior, a mirror, a fire starter. And in that moment, as the chants shook the square and flags were raised from debris, Issa knew no bullet could kill this. And no foreign hand would write this country's next chapter. The people had risen, and they were not going back. The smoke hung thick in the alleys like a second skin curling around corners and hiding the blood that stained the cobblestones. Ash rained from the rooftops in soft flakes. The once familiar market square was a different world now, less a place and more a scar still bleeding heat. But Issa moved through it like a man possessed. His boots thudded against broken glass and the splinters of crushed stalls. He ducked under a collapsed awning, past the crumpled bodies of mercenaries, some still twitching, others stilled forever. The echoes of distant chants rose behind him, a roar of people reclaiming breath space dignity. But Issa wasn't done. He was hunting the devil. And the devil wore a tailored suit and smiled through wars. He found him 2 alleys east of the spice carts near the burned husk of an overturned fruit truck. Kruger was there, his coat singed at the hem, his face streaked with soot and fury. 2 mercenaries flanked him, both injured, dragging him through the smoke toward an armored car. Kruger turned and saw him. Their eyes locked. Kruger raised a pistol, shaking desperate. "You think this is over, Issa," he snarled. "I made this country. I gave it a future. Without men like me, you'd still be in mud huts praying to idols." Issa said nothing. He raised his rifle, but not to shoot. Instead, he rushed forward, slamming the stock into the first mercenary's chest, sending him crashing into the wall. The second tried to draw, but Issa dropped him with a swift kick to the ribs and a brutal strike to the jaw. Kruger stumbled backward, firing wildly. The bullet flew wide. Issa stepped into the smoke and grabbed him by the collar. He dragged him into the open square where the crowd had gathered, breathless and bloodied, rallying around their wounded and dead. Traoré stood nearby, surrounded by loyal guards, but his eyes were on Issa. Issa shoved Kruger to the ground in front of them all. The foreign agent coughed, tried to stand, but Issa pressed a foot to his chest, pinning him. Then he spoke not just to Kruger, but to the city. "We were nothing because we believed you," Issa growled. His voice cracked, but it carried. "You came into our country with promises and smiles. You made deals behind our backs. You bought our pain and sold it for profit. You fed us war and told us it was order." Kruger writhed beneath him, eyes wide. Issa leaned down inches from his face. But now he whispered, "You belong to the people." He stepped back, and the crowd surged forward. Hands grabbed Kruger, rough hands, calloused hands, hands that had held grief too long. He screamed once, a shrill foreign sound swallowed by the chant now rising again. "Ouagadougou, Ouagadougou." They dragged him into the crowd away from the palace, into the depths of the city he thought he could control. Traoré stepped forward. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He simply lifted his hand, a quiet, firm salute to the man who had once held a gun to his back. Issa returned it. No words were needed, not now. Because in the ruins of betrayal, something else had been born. The devil had been unmasked, and the country was no longer afraid. The sun dipped low over the village square, casting long shadows that bled into the earth like secrets refusing to stay buried. Smoke still lingered in the distance, a reminder of the battle fought miles away. But here among the cracked wells and empty windows, silence reigned. They had gathered the elders, the mothers, the children, the farmers, in dust-stained robes, not because they were called, but because they had heard. Word spreads faster than radio in places where truth travels by mouth and memory. The soldier had returned, alone. Issa stood in the center of the village, his head lowered, barefoot, unarmed, stripped of all insignia. There was no uniform now, no rifle, no excuse, only truth. His voice was low at first, caught between dust and shame. "You all knew me once," he began, eyes fixed on the ground. "Before I was a soldier, before I left this place chasing promises." Children watched from behind their mothers' skirts. Old men leaned on carved sticks, frowning in silence. Issa took a step forward. "I don't ask for forgiveness. I came to confess." The air held still. "I took the money," he said. A murmur. Not shock, just confirmation. "I took it to save my son," Issa continued, louder now. "But the moment I accepted that briefcase, I killed something inside me. I pointed a gun at the man who trusted me, who called me brother. And I was ready," his voice cracked. "I was ready to let him die." He dropped to his knees, fists clenched against the dirt. "I did not pull the trigger," he said, "but I was willing. And that is betrayal just the same." The old teacher, the one who had once taught Issa his first alphabet, stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. His face was unreadable. "And why come here?" he asked. "Why not stay in the capital where they now sing your name like a hero?" Issa didn't look up. "Because they don't know the whole of me." "You do. Because the truth doesn't belong in parades, it belongs here, where I first learned right from wrong." He raised his eyes, locking onto the faces of the people who had watched him grow. "I don't ask you to welcome me. I don't ask you to forget. I only ask one thing." He turned toward the small group standing beneath the mango tree, where Aminata stood holding their son in her arms, eyes swollen but unbroken. "Let my boy walk these roads without shame," Issa said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Let him have a name that doesn't carry my stain. You may curse me, but spare him." The silence grew heavy, thick with memory and grief. Then softly Aminata stepped forward. She walked past the murmuring crowd, her son still wrapped to her back. She stopped in front of Issa. For a moment she said nothing. Then she knelt too. She laid a hand on his shoulder, not in absolution, but in acknowledgement. Behind her the old teacher nodded once. One by one the villagers stepped forward. No applause, no ceremony, just presence. Because in this village confession didn't erase the past, but it meant something. It meant he had come back, and that was where healing always began. The wind moved gently through the village square, but no one spoke. They stood in a wide circle around Issa, elders, farmers, mothers, children, all silent. Their eyes did what their mouths would not. Eyes that had watched him grow, leave, and now kneel before them, broken by his own truth. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy like heat before a storm. Some looked down at his dirt-streaked face with sorrow, others with disappointment. But the harshest gaze came from a young boy holding a wooden slingshot, not older than 10. He looked at Issa as if trying to understand how someone so tall, so strong could fall so far. Issa didn't flinch. He knelt still, back straight, head bowed. Not from fear, but from surrender. He had come here to be seen, to be judged. And the silence was his sentence. Then from the crowd the sound of boots, polished, steady. President Traoré stepped forward, flanked by 2 unarmed guards. He wore no medals today, no ceremonial sash. Just a simple white shirt stained with the same red earth as the rest of them. He walked with slow, deliberate steps until he stood beside Issa, so close their shadows touched. The villagers watched him, breath held, waiting for the weight of his words. Traoré looked down at the man who once pointed a gun at his back. Then quietly he spoke. This man fell, he said, his voice deep and clear, but he rose again. His words hung in the air, echoing between walls of clay and silence. He betrayed me once, not with bullets, but with doubt. And yet when the moment came, he chose courage over fear, truth over comfort. A few heads turned toward each other. Someone exhaled shaky. Traoré continued, I have the power to condemn him, but I will not take his life, because the revolution we are building, this new Ouagadougou, is not made of revenge. It is made of men brave enough to crawl through shame to stand again. He paused, looking not at Issa, but at the people. So I give his life back to you. The silence trembled, then broke. Someone near the well began to clap. Soft, hesitant. Another voice joined, then a third, and suddenly the stillness cracked wide open. Waisa, Issa, Issa. It wasn't a shout of celebration. It was something deeper, raw, human. A chant not of worship but of recognition. A man who had fallen and stood back up. A man who had burned and carried the scar instead of hiding it. Issa's hands trembled as he looked up. He didn't smile. He couldn't. But his eyes, shimmering with salt and dust, met Traoré's, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not even brotherhood, but a kind of peace only earned in blood and silence. The crowd surged forward not to embrace him, but to stand beside him. And for the first time, Issa no longer felt like he was kneeling. He felt like he was home. The sun had barely risen when Issa was summoned to the capital. He rode in the back of a modest black jeep, dusty and dented, escorted not by soldiers but by silence. The streets of the city were different now. Windows, once shuttered, had opened again, and children chased stray goats through alleyways where bullets had flown just days before. The air smelled of sweat, ash, and possibility. At the palace gates, Issa was greeted by two familiar faces, Captain Mahdi and a smiling young aide who offered him water and a pressed envelope. No handcuffs, no cold glares, only respect. Inside, President Traoré stood by a window overlooking the city. He turned as Issa entered. No speeches, no ceremony. I meant what I said, Traoré began, stepping forward. Ouagadougou needs men like you. Not perfect, not polished, but proven. He held out the envelope. Minister of Public Defense, clean the ranks, rebuild the trust. Issa didn't reach for it. He stared at the envelope, then at the man who once called him brother still did in his eyes. And in that moment he felt the weight of everything they had survived pressing in from the corners of the room. I'm not the one, Issa said quietly. Traoré blinked. You have every right. I don't need power to serve, Issa interrupted gently. What broke me wasn't just politics. It was forgetting where I came from, forgetting why I ever picked up a rifle. He paused, then added, give that seat to someone younger, someone who still wants to fight wars. I've had enough of bullets. Traoré didn't argue. He simply nodded once firmly, and that was enough. 2 weeks later, Issa walked up the overgrown path behind the village schoolhouse. The same schoolhouse where the faded chalkboard still read, "The future is ours." The roof leaked in two corners. Half the desks were cracked. The only globe was sun-bleached and dated. But Issa smiled as he stepped inside, chalk in one hand, his son's small fingers gripping the other. He didn't speak much the first day. He just wrote a single word on the board in large, bold strokes, dignity. The children stared at him wide-eyed, unsure what to make of a teacher who walked with a soldier's posture and spoke with a voice like gravel and wind. But as the weeks passed, they warmed. They listened. And Issa taught not just history or math, but how to ask questions, how to stand, how to speak even when your voice shakes. He told stories, not of heroes and villains, but of choices, of failure, of redemption. One day a girl asked him why he had scars on his arms. He told her they were mistakes, marks from when he tried to be someone he wasn't. She nodded solemnly, then asked if she could still learn to write like him. He laughed for the first time in months, because the real battle had begun. And this time his weapon was not steel, it was chalk, and it would write the future. Every morning just after dawn, Issa arrived at the schoolhouse with a limp and a smile. His crutch tapped a slow rhythm on the dusty path, steady as a heartbeat. Children ran past him in waves, barefoot, wild with laughter, calling out Master Issa with voices like songbirds. He never rushed them. He simply walked his pace, nodding, smiling the tip of his wooden crutch, nudging up little clouds of red soil. By the time the first bell rang, he would be at the blackboard, sleeves rolled, chalk in hand. He never missed a day. The classroom was small and crumbling, patched with mismatched bricks and graffiti from a generation before. But inside it pulsed with something greater than walls, a hunger to learn, to grow, to matter. Issa taught more than dates and names. He taught resilience traced through the broken bones of revolutions. He spoke of dignity, even in silence, of standing tall with nothing in your pockets but truth. He used stories not of heroes and villains, but of flawed men and brave choices. He let the children interrupt him. He let them question everything. Sometimes they asked about the limp, or the war, or the president. He answered simply, "I walked away from the wrong path. This crutch helps me stay on the right one." Behind the schoolhouse, laughter echoed through the yard. His son, once pale, once skeletal, once dying, now chased a football barefoot through the dust, kicking with unfiltered joy. The boy's laugh was a song that played through Issa's chest like a drumbeat. Aminata often watched from the edge of the field, a basket of vegetables in her lap, her eyes never leaving them, husband and son reborn in sunlight. Sometimes Issa would pause during class, listening to the laughter outside, and smile. He had traded medals for math books, guns for chalk, orders for questions, and he had never known more peace than in that noisy, imperfect little school where hope arrived every day with scratched knees and bright eyes. That was his legacy now, not the war, the lesson. It was a Wednesday when the black car came. No sirens, no escort, just the slow hum of wheels on clay road and the soft thump of doors opening in front of the schoolhouse. The children froze at the windows. Even the goats outside stopped to look. Traoré stepped out alone. He wore no suit today, just a crisp cotton shirt, sleeves rolled dust on his shoes. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand, and in the other a small box wrapped in plain cloth. Issa met him beneath the mango tree behind the school, where generations of boys had carved initials into its bark, and first kisses had been dared. They shook hands like old friends, though they hadn't spoken in nearly a year. "I hear your students are better informed than some of my ministers," Traoré said with a grin. Issa chuckled, settling onto the low bench beneath the shade. "They ask harder questions." Traoré handed him the briefcase. "Open it." Inside were papers, sealed documents, decrees, Minister of National Education, Director of Cultural Reconstruction, Advisor to the Office of the President. "All yours if you say the word," Traoré said. Issa didn't look at the titles long. Instead, he closed the case slowly and placed it beside him. Then just as slowly, he shook his head. "You want to honor me," he said, voice soft but firm. "Build schools that don't collapse when it rains. Pay teachers on time. Give chalk to every hand, not medals to mine." Traoré said nothing for a long moment. Then he smiled, leaned back on the bench, and exhaled. "I knew you'd say that." They sat in silence, watching children play soccer in the field beyond the trees. The ball was made of rags, the goalposts of sticks, but no one seemed to care. After a time, Traoré placed the small wrapped box on Issa's lap. Thank you," he said. Issa unwrapped it. Inside was his old crutch, the one he'd left behind in the capital. Polished now, repaired. The wood gleamed. Traoré smiled. "I had it cleaned. Thought it might belong in a museum." Issa laughed a deep, shaking laugh. "Let the people decide that." And they sat a little longer. Two men beneath an old tree, no longer soldier and president, just brothers born of the same war, choosing different ways to heal it. Years passed. The war faded into textbooks and whispered stories. Streets once painted in blood now bore murals of open hands and olive branches. And in the capital city across from the parliament, a new museum rose from old stone, dedicated not to conquest, but to memory. Inside, the halls were wide and quiet, painted in soft shades of sand and sun. In one corner, past the weapons and photos, beside a display of children's drawings from the war, stood a glass case. Simple, clean, and inside it a wooden crutch, worn at the grip, burnished, smooth where a hand had once clutched it day after day. Nothing else, just the crutch. A little girl stood in front of it now, about 8 years old. Her class had come for a field trip led by a tall, thin guide with a warm smile and quiet voice. Most of her classmates had moved on, drawn toward the louder exhibits. But she stayed, staring. Something about the crutch held her. Whose was it, she asked. The guide stepped beside her, hands folded. That, he said, belonged to a man named Issa Diallo. He was once a soldier, then a bodyguard, then a teacher. The girl looked up, eyes wide. What did he do? The guide's smile deepened, touched with something older than pride. He held up a crutch. That crutch held up a man, and that man held up a nation. The girl pressed her palm gently to the glass, not for spectacle, not for awe, but for something quieter. Thank you, she whispered. And though the case didn't reply, the light through the skylight seemed to flicker in agreement. She turned to catch up with her class, skipping ahead, her braid bouncing behind her. Behind her, the crutch remained, a relic not of war, but of what comes after, of choices, of redemption, of a man who taught a nation to rise not by standing tall, but by kneeling first and standing again. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with bullets, but with conscience. Issa's story reminds us that redemption isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing courage over comfort when it matters most. He could have vanished into guilt or power, but instead he chose to serve in silence, shaping lives with chalk instead of a rifle. It's a reminder that even broken paths can lead to something beautiful if we're brave enough to change direction. Because in the end, what truly defines us, the mistakes we've made, or the choices we make after, what would you choose if no one was watching? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.